The contract had specified 3 months, which Eli Marsh had initially considered generous for the scope of work, and had subsequently revised to barely sufficient after the first week, when he understood that he was not teaching a curriculum, but attempting to translate two entirely different philosophies of what it meant to exist near another person. The Sorvathi practiced distance the way other species practiced breathing, automatically, continuously, with the kind of unconscious precision that revealed how deeply the habit had been installed. Not coldness. The briefing materials had been careful to distinguish between emotional warmth, which the Sorvathi possessed in abundance, and physical proximity, which they rationed with a care that made human social norms look, by comparison, like a contact sport. Princess Ethan was 17 years old, which translated approximately to the human developmental stage of someone old enough to understand what was expected and young enough to still find some of it genuinely alarming. She had been assigned to him by the Palace Protocol Office with a briefing document that ran to 40 pages and a single handwritten edition at the bottom from the Queen herself, in a script his translation implant rendered as, "She is ready to learn. Please ensure she is ready to be seen." Eli had read this twice and understood that the 40 pages were the formal requirement and the handwritten line was the actual assignment. He set up his workspace in the consultation room the palace had assigned him, which had ceilings high enough to suggest that the Sorvathi either had a cultural relationship with vertical space or simply built everything as though they expected to grow, and waited. Ethan arrived exactly on time, which he noted. She sat at the precise distance from the table that maximized her view of everything in the room while keeping the maximum possible space between herself and him, which he also noted. She had the Sorvathi characteristic of very still hands, not tense stillness, but the stillness of someone for whom unnecessary movement was simply not a category of behavior they had developed. She looked at him with the direct, assessing attention of someone who had been told to take this seriously and had decided independently that she agreed. "You're going to teach me to touch people," she said. It was not a question. It was the particular delivery of someone naming a thing they found strange in order to make it less strange. "I'm going to teach you that humans touch people," Eli said, "and what it means when we do, and how to move through that without it meaning what it would mean if you did it." She considered this. "That seems complicated." "It gets easier," he said. "Most things do." She opened the notepad she had brought, physical, leather-bound, the kind of object that communicated that she intended to treat the information as worth keeping, and looked at him with the expression of someone prepared to begin. He began. The second week introduced handshakes, which Ethan approached with the focused attention of someone diffusing something. She had watched the instructional footage he had prepared. She had read the contextual materials. She understood, theoretically, that a handshake was a greeting gesture that carried no intimacy by human standards. A contact so routinized that most humans performed it without registering it as touch at all. Understanding theoretically and reaching out her hand were, she discovered, different competencies. "You're anticipating it," Eli said, watching her reset her posture for the fourth time. "I'm preparing," she said. In handshake terms, those look the same and they produce different results. Preparation looks like readiness. Anticipation looks like you're about to receive bad news. She looked at him. "For my people, this would be bad news." "I know. That's why we're practicing." He extended his hand. "The goal isn't to feel nothing. The goal is to do it correctly while feeling whatever you feel and to feel less every time." She looked at his extended hand for a moment. Then she reached out and shook it, brief, correct pressure, appropriate duration, exactly as the footage had shown. "How was that?" she asked. "Technically perfect," he said. "How was it for you?" She considered. "Like touching a door handle that is also a person," she said. "Functional but strange." He laughed. It surprised her. He could see that from the slight adjustment of her stillness. And then something at the edges of her expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same structural family. "That's an excellent description," he said, "and that's exactly the right relationship to have with it." She wrote something in her notepad. He did not ask what. The weeks developed their own rhythm, which he had not anticipated and found, without examining it too carefully, to be the best part of the work. She was a precise student, which he had expected from the briefing materials. She was also a curious one, which he had not expected, and her curiosity moved in directions his curriculum hadn't mapped. She asked not just how humans did things, but why, not the diplomatic why, the reason it mattered for protocol, but the underneath why, the reason the behaviors had developed into the forms they had taken. She asked about the history of handshakes, which led to a conversation about medieval weaponry and trust that lasted an hour and covered none of the scheduled material, and which he later identified as the session where the work shifted from instruction to something else. She taught him things in return, not deliberately but through the accumulation of her explanations when he asked his own questions. He learned that the Sorvathi distance was not about fear of others, but about the weight they assigned to proximity, that to stand close to someone was to enter a register of relationship that carried obligations, that the physical management of space was the physical management of commitment. He learned that they had a word with no human equivalent for the specific quality of someone who stood at the edge of your comfortable distance and made the distance feel smaller, and that the word was considered a significant one in their vocabulary. He did not ask which category he fell into. It seemed impolite. By the end of the second month, her handshake was indistinguishable from a human's. By the beginning of the third, she could navigate a simulated reception line with the ease of someone who had done it before, adjusting contact level by cue, reading the room, deploying the warmth that the protocols required without the stiffness that had characterized her first attempts. She was, he told her in the sixth week, genuinely ready. She wrote something in her notepad and did not show him. The formal presentation ceremony was held in the Hall of Witness, which was named, the palace historian had informed him, for the tradition of important moments being observed by the court, so that they existed not just in the memory of participants, but in the collective record of those who saw them. The queen sat at the hall's elevated position, with the assembled court, arranged in the formal configuration that the protocol office had described as reserved for occasions of state significance. The human diplomatic delegation occupied the section to the left, arranged with the careful positioning of people who understood they were here to observe something and were taking that role seriously. Eli stood at the edge of the presentation space and watched Ethan enter. She was wearing the formal court dress, which for Sorvathi royalty was a construction of layered materials that communicated rank through a semiotic system. He had spent an afternoon trying to understand and mostly failed to, except for the general impression of someone who had been prepared for visibility. She moved through the space with the composure of someone who had been trained for composure from birth and had, additionally, spent 3 months being trained for a specific performance of it. She greeted the queen first. The human-style acknowledgement she had developed, a modified bow that incorporated elements of both species' formal greeting, something they had worked on in the final 2 weeks as a bridge gesture, was executed with a precision that made the protocol office representative exhale with the particular relief of someone whose job had just been made easier. She moved through the court representatives in sequence, handshakes deployed with the calibrated warmth of someone who had practiced, until the calibration was invisible. She reached the human diplomatic delegation and moved through it with the ease of someone on familiar ground. It was, Eli observed from the edge of the space, exactly what they had prepared. Every element correct, every transition smooth, the 3 months of work visible in the performance the way good preparation was always visible, not as effort but as ease. The presentation concluded. He prepared to bow out of the formal space, because his role was preparation and the preparation was complete, and what happened next was hers, not his, and the appropriate thing was to step back and let her take the room. She walked toward him. not the measured walk of the presentation. The practical, direct walk of someone crossing a room to reach a specific destination. And the destination was him. And the court was watching. And he had approximately 2 seconds to process what he was observing before she arrived at the distance that was the absolute boundary of Sorvathi personal space, and then crossed it and kept going and put her arms around him. The hall was absolutely silent. He stood in the embrace of the princess of the Sorvathi court, in front of the queen and the assembled court and the human diplomatic delegation, and his professional training produced no useful output for approximately 4 seconds because his professional training had not included this scenario. He put his arms around her carefully, because she was hugging him and he was a person who responded to being hugged, and because whatever was happening, it was happening, and the appropriate response to someone choosing to reach across everything their culture had taught them in order to express something was not to stand there like furniture. The silence held. She stepped back after a moment that was long enough to be unmistakable and not long enough to be anything other than what it was, a complete gesture, a thing done fully and then finished. She looked at him with the direct steadiness that had been there from the first session, and then she turned to face the court, and to face her mother, and the queen's expression was doing something that cycled through phases he could track even without a xenobiological briefing. "He taught me," Ethan said, to the silence and to the court and to her mother, and to everyone in the hall of witness who was there to ensure that important things existed in the collective record, that humans show care through touch that means nothing. I wanted him to know that this means everything. The silence continued for a moment longer. Eli became aware that his own expression was doing something he was not managing very effectively, which was a novel professional experience for someone who had spent 14 years in diplomatic contexts that required face management. He became aware that the queen was looking at him with an expression that had arrived somewhere past the shock phase and into something he could only describe as the expression of someone revising a category. He became aware that Ethan was looking at him with the patient steadiness of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. He had spent 3 months teaching her that human touch was casual. He had drilled this with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the entire purpose of the lesson was to protect her from misreading the gestures she would encounter, to give her the knowledge that a human handshake didn't carry what a Sorvathi touch carried, so she could receive it without the weight her culture assigned. He had believed, teaching her to understand a distinction. She had learned the distinction. She had learned it well enough to understand that the distinction ran both directions, that if human touch could mean nothing, then Sorvathi touch meant everything, and that choosing to cross from one register to the other in front of everyone who mattered was not a misunderstanding of the lesson, but the furthest possible extension of it. He had taught her the protocol. She had just taught him why protocols existed, not to prevent expression, but to make certain expressions unmistakable. "Your sovereignty," he said, to the queen, because something needed to be said and she was the person it needed to be said to, and he was going to say it with whatever composure he had remaining, which was less than usual but sufficient. "Your daughter is prepared for the state visit. She understands human social norms better than most humans I've met." The queen looked at him for a long moment. "I see that she does," she said. Her voice was the composed voice of someone who was a sovereign and knew how to be one. But underneath, it was the voice of someone who had just watched their child do something brave in public and was filing that separately, in a different place than the diplomatic record. "And I see that she has, in the course of her preparation, acquired something not specified in the contract." "I wasn't aware of it either," Eli said, "until approximately 4 minutes ago." Something moved across the queen's expression. It was possible, he thought, that it was the Sorvathi equivalent of amusement. He did not have sufficient briefing material to confirm this. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "you are invited to attend the state visit, not as consultant, as guest." Ethan had not moved back to the formal distance. She was standing where she had stood after the hug, which was closer than his curriculum had ever designated as appropriate, and she was looking at him with the expression of someone who had done a thing they intended and was prepared to stand in it. He had come here to teach someone how to navigate a world she was afraid of. He had written lesson plans and practiced handshakes, and spent 3 months explaining that humans were casual about the things her culture treated as sacred. He had not planned to learn anything. He was revising that assessment. "I would be honored," he said. Outside the Hall of Witness, the court would spend the following days processing what they had seen, in the way that courts process things, through careful conversation and diplomatic language, and the gradual construction of a narrative that made sense of the unprecedented. The Protocol Office would note, in its official record, that the presentation ceremony had proceeded largely as planned with one unscheduled addition. The human diplomatic delegation would file a report that described the conclusion of the ceremony as culturally significant in ways that will require follow-up analysis.